Lorraine, welcome to Hollywood.
Yeah.
Chuck, you got it around your foot, so that would be careful.
It's just what I've been waiting all my life for.
This is Chuck Rand, director in the old Bristol Historical Society. We're in Madbury, New Hampshire. It's January 15th, 2020. We're in the house of Lorraine Morong, who we're going to interview. And we're also here with Russ Lane, who's the videographer, and Robert Ives, who will conduct the second part of this interview. So thanks for letting us into your house and talking to you, and especially getting the collection that you've accumulated over the years. So, what's your full name?
Lorraine Barbeau, B-A-R-B-E-A-U, Morong.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in Nashua, New Hampshire. And like I tell all the doctors at the offices, 10-24-24.
Can you tell me about your parents? When and where were they born? And sort of give me your family background.
My mother was born in New Hampshire, and my father was born in Massachusetts. And my mother was also from a French-Canadian family. My mother was one of 13 children, and she was the 11th. My father was one of half a dozen or so. There was some that died, and we don't have good records on that. But they grew up in very ordinary families. My mother's father was a blacksmith, and my father's father just was a day worker, and my father was too. For most of his life, he ended up building several houses, and that seems to run in the family.
What were their names? Your mother's name, or her maiden name, and your father's name?
My mother's name was Victorina Aurora Gendro, and my father was Wilfred Albert Barbeau.
So your family was originally from New Hampshire?
Not really. My mother happened to be born in New Hampshire because her mother was visiting there at the time she arrived. But they were Massachusetts people. They lived in Lowell.
Oh, wow. Did you hear anything? Did they talk about their ancestors at all with you?
Not really.
Okay.
I have more on my father's side for genealogy because some of my cousins have been interested.
So describe the community where you grew up in Nashua.
I didn't grow up in Nashua.
Okay.
No, they moved from Nashua to Detroit. And I started school in Detroit, Michigan, and went to school there for only a couple years, I guess, because I can remember coming back to Lowell, because my mother's people were in Lowell. And when the Depression hit, they came back to Lowell, and we lived with an aunt for a while, till finally, I guess my father got enough of a job so that they could rent a place in Lowell. So I started school in Lowell in a French. It was a French school. We had French for half of the day. Classes were in French, and the other half of the day they were in English.
And do you recall any, what was it like at that school for you?
Oh, I always liked school for whatever reason. And it wasn't always the best place in the world, but somehow or other, I always liked school.
You had a particular, like, history or Any subjects that were of interest to you beyond the ordinary?
I had a hard time with math, but the rest of it wasn't difficult. But we did everything in French and in English, except math. Math was always in English. We didn't try to get the French across with the equations.
Did you do were there any special activities you participated in? Extracurricular type things?
I always liked to skate, so in the summertime I roller skated, and in the wintertime I ice skated. And we didn't have any rinks of any kind. We just were out in the field that had gotten wet and frozen over. I remember one place where there was a huge sign for, I don't know what the billboard was for, but I remember we skated all around it and under it and in between.
What? So did you develop any hobbies while you were going to school or high school? Like collecting things or transcribing things, or?
I think basically I was always interested in reading and writing, as you can see from that collection of
Right.
notebooks that are full of my stuff.
And tell me about that stuff right now. What kind of things are in there?
Oh, those are copies of newspaper articles that I've written since, I don't know, I started writing for the newspapers in 1960.
Oh my gosh.
And I've done it pretty much since then. I didn't do it for about maybe 6 or 8 months at one point, but then somebody called me up and asked me to do it, so I started doing it again.
And that was in, what's the name of the newspaper?
Well, the first one I wrote for was the Portsmouth Herald, and then I got upset with the Portsmouth Herald, so and they changed their format. But then I began working for the Tri-Town Transcript, which was just about towns right near me. And then they went out of business after a few years, and Foster's Daily Democrat called me up and asked me if I'd take over the Madbury beat. And so I did that, and I've been on that ever since.
Okay. Did you, outside of the house, did you have a job? Did you have a career of any sort?
Well, I had 5 children,
Well, yeah.
and
And what were they? What are their names?
what are their names?
Yeah.
William, Bennett, Mark, Sally, and Dana.
And they grew up in.
They grew up mostly in South Berwick and in Madbury.
Did you? Well, I'm going to skip right to. Let me ask you about your marriage. Who did you marry?
I married William Henry Morong, Jr.,
And what year was that?
1944.
Was there? Where did you marry?
In New York City.
Why did you happen to be there?
It was the war, during the war, for World War II, and he was working there, and it wasn't a time when you could travel easily at all. And so I went down to New York City because we didn't have much time at all. He was working actually for the Atomic Energy Commission. And we ended up leaving New York very shortly and going to Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
Okay. So let me ask you about your children. Can you kind of talk about each one a little bit?
And the oldest one is now designing an organ that can be taken apart and put in the back of his SUV and dragged to church, and then unshackled and put back in the organ and taken home.
Now, who's that?
My son William.
William.
And he worked in electronics a lot. And he also spent quite a few years designing and building harnesses for horses. My second son was Bennett, and he worked in a bank. He was a mortgage officer for a long time and ended up as an appraiser. And my third son, who was Mark Duff, known to us as Duffy, he had his own business installing overhead garage doors. And he built the house next door, and he's just a tinkerer and a builder of cars, equipment, whatever. Anything that's broken, we got to rattle it and see what's loose.
Right.
My daughter is, she's working in Massachusetts, and she's been working with companies that deal with those cell towers. She works with a computer all the time. What else do people do anymore?
Right.
And she was one of the first graduates of the College of the Atlantic. And she also, after that, went to the Bath Iron Works and stayed there 3 years and graduated from one of the courses. Dana's he's at home with me now, and he was when his father needed him. But he's done surveying, holding the stick, and he's very much interested and involved in the world of geology.
And so, as a segue, I'm going to ask you, what led you to go to Louds Island to begin with? How did that all occur?
Oh, I guess it occurred because my father-in-law died and left each of his children about $5,000.
And who was your grandfather?
This was my husband's father.
Oh, wow.
William, he's Frederick. And no, that's not my husband's father. That's my husband's grandfather. That picture is. But he was the lighthouse keeper. And my husband always had this yearning for the water. And so we decided that we'd try to find a little piece of land that we could camp on, even with the children, near the water, kind of in memory of Grandpa. Well, Grandpa he'd been brought up on the coast and went to school out of Little River Island, but he ended up being a pharmacist in Madison, Maine, quite ways from the ocean, but the love of the ocean just seemed to permeate that family anyway, so my husband really liked the water. And when we bought this house, a big advantage here was that there was water right at the end of the street, tidal water. So we parked our kids with friends. Well, the oldest was already in the Army, and the second one was working, but we took the other three, and they stayed with friends of ours. And my husband and I took off and said we'd go and see if we could find any place along the coast that we could buy. And we got up to Bristol, he got sick. He had a tendency to do that. And he ended up in the hospital in Damariscotta. And I was down there with Arthur and his wife Carolyn. They lived in Bristol, across the bridge from right in back of the town hall there, where the little bridge, and there's a house in there. And I've forgotten what their second name was. Arthur and Carolyn Young, exactly. And so they said we could park in their yard, because we had some kind of a SUV type, an early SUV type, I guess. And I took him to the hospital and left him there in the middle of the night. And come to find out, his gallbladder was hot.
Oh, no.
And the doctor said he had to stay there. And this is a big woman doctor. And he was there for a week. And she didn't want to discharge him then. And he said, well, he's had to report back to work. And she said, too bad. And she told them he wasn't going to be back to work. And she was so disgusted with him that she told him he had another week off. So we didn't have to rush back home. And then he did go back to work. But he had a hot gallbladder. And eventually he had to have surgery on it. And then that's solved quite a few of his problems. But at any rate, that's how we got to be at the end of Bristol Peninsula, or almost down there. And I didn't have anything to do except visit him in the hospital. And so he said, why don't you go look around the coast? And Arthur and Carolyn told me about Louds Island, and I said, what's that? You know, I had no idea. And I ended up going to the end of the dock and bumming a ride over with a fisherman, and dropped me off at Cecil's Priors. And I walked across the island, and Cecil said, be sure to be here at 3 o'clock, so somebody's going to be going back. Otherwise, I was there for the night. And so I walked across the island, and not the Priors were there. And I met Elizabeth and Cecil, of course. And then I went across, and I met Delia Heisem and the boys over there. But they were the only people that were there. There may have been somebody on the way, but I didn't see any other people. I just walked the path, and I walked down to the shore, and I came back, and they told me that one of the houses there was Dick Tukey's, and he wasn't in it. And that maybe we could go stay in it. So actually in that second week that the doctor gave my husband, we went out to the island. One of the fishermen took us out. I came home and got the children and the dog and the parakeet. And while I was here, I whipped up a batch of bread and left it in the pot, and we baked it just before we went over. And the fisherman that took us over appreciated the bread. You can buy anything with bread, homemade bread. I found in my life, homemade bread buys anything. So we were taken over, and we had no idea what was in that house. I brought a little camp stove, and I figured, well, we'll just see. People had stayed in the house, so I figured there must be some things in the house, and Dick Tukey was willing for us to go in. So we went in, and we stayed there for a week. I refrigerated my food by putting it in the cellar in a wet box, wet wooden box. That'll work, you know. Put a wet towel over it. And we managed okay. And the children did some fishing Cecil let them use a boat. You know, he would.
Yeah.
And they caught some fish, and it was Duffy and Sally and Dana that were with us. The parakeet I left on the mainland, but the dog we took with us.
And what year was this?
It had to be 1966. And we enjoyed being in the house. Everything was there that we needed. And the stove didn't work, but we had that little plate, I don't know, gas or something. Anyway, we made out fine and enjoyed the week, and came back home and tried to figure out, because they told us that the house was for sale.
Oh.
So we tried to figure out whether we really wanted to get into that or not. His Bill's having been sick and all, it wasn't the most easy time to be making up your mind about acquiring more property, but he really connected to the ocean so much that it was really something that he was really into it. And so we bought the house, and there was a little building in back of it. And while we were cogitating that winter, the building fell on the ground, so then everything that was in the building was covered over, so we didn't know what was in that. So we had a lot of adventures, and Bill was always very handy. He could build. He was very cautious about these things. So it took an awful long time for things to get done, but he knew how to do it all. And we went over, and first thing, I guess, he fixed the mess under the back door that had rotted out, tackled the things that were most needing, and we just enjoyed being there, and so did the children, and then the others came when they were able. So that's how we got there.
So we left off, Lorraine, in 1966 with you spending a week on Loud's Island down in the Crick area. And whose house was it that you were staying in that...
Richard Tukey's.
Oh, it was Richard Tukey's actual house.
Yes.
And had he told you that he was selling it then?
Carolyn and Arthur had spoken to him.
I see.
And his wife had died. And he was not interested in going there without her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
And when you purchased it, was that like in the next year?
Yes.
I don't want to be too personal, but how much did it cost?
$2,500. And my granddaughters are supposed to be paying me $75,000.
Oh, wow.
It was appraised for $95,000.
Oh.
I said, that's too much. It's only a quarter of an acre, and it's not very private. And the view of Monhegan is now blocked out.
Yeah.
So that, as far as I was concerned, reduced the value by $20,000.
And when you moved onto the island, who was living in that area of the Crick? There are about 7 houses in there.
The only ones that were living there were the Hysums.
Oh,
And they had their 2 grandsons with them,
I see.
but nobody else lived there. John Heil was in the house next door.
Yeah.
He was fishing with Cecil.
Oh.
He was I think he was he a Yale? He was a college student anyway.
Yes, I think at Trinity College.
And he was living there next door. But there was nobody in what's now Christensen's, which was Ken Boss's, and there was nobody in Tomasho's house. But that's the year when everybody moved in.
Oh.
The Tomashio's, Jane Tomassio's brother John Claflin bought the house that the Tomascios are in now.
Mm-hmm.
And the one that Ken Boss had was empty for a couple more years.
Mm-hmm.
But there was nobody in the big store.
Oh.
And I guess Maury was down the road a piece. Maury Heckscher.
Mm-hmm.
Because he had his house before we did. Several years. And of course the Pryors were at their house.
And why did all of the island people begin selling those houses?
They sold them because the school was closed. The state closed the school because there were too few pupils. Then the people who had children had to move off in the wintertime. That's when the Giffords moved over. And they'd come back in the summer. The Giffords come back in the summer. And I'm trying to think if there's anybody else, but all those houses that became summer houses were transferred around that same period, the late 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And John Claflin bought the house. That was John Hyle's house was Steve Carter's. But John Hyle, the house is now Tomascio's. It's Dottie at the lunch place.
Yeah, Dottie Willette.
Yes, it's her grandmother,
Yes.
and she was Dorothy.
Oh, yes.
And I'm getting forgetful. I'm aware of that, but I don't remember Dorothy's name now.
Mm-hmm. Murphy?
Murphy, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was Ed Murphy.
Right.
Ed Murphy and Dot. Yeah. And then Ken Boss's house, which is now the Christensens, that was empty for quite a while. Hilda Libby bought it.
Oh.
And she painted it. She had somebody come and paint it, and then she sold it.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Cecil and Elizabeth were also going off?
They went off in the wintertime, I think.
Yes, right.
But they were there all summer. And Cecil used to, you know, we didn't have a boat to begin with, so we'd have somebody bring us over from the mainland, and then Cecil would, and then he'd put all our luggage in his truck and drive it down to our house. Oh, the mosquitoes were something terrible before Carson. Holy smoke, the mosquitoes would eat you alive. They were like a wall. But that year that we went there, I don't know whether, I think it may have been Westcott that started the thing. He knew John Hyle, or he knew some of those kids, and they were all the same age. Mm-hmm. And they bought these houses for almost nothing and began fixing them up. Mm-hmm. And I went to the dump. I'd go to the dump because they'd throw away stuff. And I'd say, whoopee, not going to throw that away. Have a little hair dish cover. I don't know if you know what a hair dish is. During World War I, women had long hair, and they would comb their hair and save the hair and put it in this hair dish. The hair dish was just, they were fancy little dishes. And the one we had, well, I don't have all of it, I have the cover. The cover is about that big, maybe 4 inches across. And it's got a hole in the middle of the top, and you put the hair in the hole, and you save the hair. The hair was used in the guns for the sight.
Oh.
And at any rate, the hair was saved. And the hair dish cover that I have says on it, "Souvenir of Muscongas Island." And that I saved out of the dump. Those guys cleaned out the cupboard, and I'm glad I have it.
What is the name of the island?
What's the name of the island?
What is the name that you use for the island?
I like to call it Muscongas Island. I think that that's the real name. But, of course, the Loud came from the Loud's family, and Eddie Poland did his best to enhance that every chance he got. In the bottom of one of those containers, that other container, that we didn't get to the bottom, there may be, if it isn't there, it's at the island, and I'll have to turn it over to you. There's a whole packet of letters that Eddie Poland wrote. Because he did things like tell people he'd sell them a piece of land, and then after they got all ready to buy it, he'd say, well, of course you understand that you're to move your house onto it. That was one of the contingencies. And there's a bunch of correspondence that he and Helen Poland had with a cousin of hers, of theirs, because I think they were related. And the man was a surveyor for the city of New York, and he was as nutty as a fruit cake. That probably shouldn't be put in public, but anyway, the papers, the kind of stuff they wrote back and forth was just unbelievable. They're so distracted. They're really very, very odd. But I got those papers out of what's now Michael Cheney's house. And Michael's father, Ken, got them out of the house that the Rusts now own. Just scattered all through the house. And they'd been picked up and put in a wheelbarrow and taken down to Cheney's, and he had them in a little alcove over the stairway, and he let me go through them, and I copied some of the stuff that I thought was pertinent to the island, but there was a lot of stuff that wasn't. Helen Poland, she did some writing for some of those old magazines, and there was some of that stuff there. And of course the squirrels had done a job on a lot of it too.
Lorraine, how would you summarize your 50-plus years on the island? What was it like for you and your family?
Ooh, it was a very enjoyable time. My children all enjoyed being there, what times they could be. And it was so totally different from anything I could have expected as a child or as a young person. A whole other world, in effect, learning to do without electricity. And I had experienced an outhouse when I was a child. I wasn't without that experience, but and then I think the melding of the new people and the old, all these young people were there, and they had their own agenda, and getting to know and meld with the older people who were there in the summertime, as we were there in the summer, it was a very interesting and it was a good experience, and I think it was good for them, and it was good for us.
Yeah. Wonderful. How about the church? How was the church, when you first arrived, changed down through the 50 to 60 years you were there?
Well, when we first went, the ministers came and stayed. They stayed for a month. Mm-hmm. Lionel was there for a month, I think. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Goist was there for at least a month. Sometimes I'm not sure they weren't there longer. Yeah. And their whole family would come, and there was a lot of, I got to be quite friendly with them and visited the Goists in Pennsylvania. Wow. And the wonderful family. And I think that one of the things I might not have expected was that the island people were so accepting of the outsiders coming.
Yeah.
They were glad to see the houses being refurnished. They didn't need rebuilding, but they needed some picking up that hadn't been done, because we came right after the school. They closed the school in '64. And then those people that had been on island year round had to go off in the summer. They became summer people too. But I always felt that they were very much interested in these outsiders, which you don't always get. You don't get from the Ruth Moore books.
Yes. What are one or two of your fondest memories about Misconkus Island?
Catching buckets full of mackerel. I just loved catching mackerel, and I had lots of good times catching mackerel. Maury and Fenella had guests. I think the woman was in charge of Strawberry Bank for a while, Jane somebody, and she had a boy. He was about 15 years old, and Fenella wanted him to have the experience of fishing there, but they didn't have a boat that was suitable. So I said, I'll take him fishing. I fished all the time. And so we arranged, and it was a foggy, foggy day. You could hardly see a hand in front of your face. And I got in my boat and I went down, picked up this 15-year-old, and he turned to me and he said, "Do you want me to handle it?" And I said, "I don't think you need to." So we got in the boat and we went out, and we hit the big school of mackerel, and we're catching them hand over fist, and there's somebody else out there in a boat. We can't see them, but we can hear them. They're not catching a thing. We're catching all the fish, and this kid's eyes are getting bigger and bigger all the time. Of course, he had to end up cleaning a whole bunch of fish. I'm not sure he was as happy then as he was when he set out. But he wanted to go fishing, he went fishing.
Mm-hmm. You said that your first way onto the island was with Cecil Pryor in his boat called the Free Rider.
Yep.
And how did you, after that, get on and off the island?
Well, my husband had to have a boat, so we had a boat, and he put out a mooring, and so we had a boat and we had a mooring, and it was, I think, one of the things that made my husband happiest. He really enjoyed that. That's a picture of him up on the book on the file cabinet.
Do you remember any fires on the island?
Oh, I remember when the schoolhouse burned down.
Oh, yeah.
I happened to be on there with a friend of mine, Valerie. And we were sitting eating our lunch, late lunch, in the backyard. And she said something about what would happen if there was a fire here. And I said, I guess you'd have to open a can of soup and pour it on it. But actually, there was a fire, and it was that, I don't know how it didn't burn the whole island down. I just don't understand it. Mm-hmm. It was that building just was consumed, and the flames were coming out of the windows down. I never saw anything like it in my life, and I don't want to see it. And those men were out there putting what little water they had, and of course the state sent the airplanes with the bags of water or something, and that was helpful. But we didn't get a breeze that afternoon.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what saved the island.
And didn't the Bristol Fire Department come over, and they were very helpful?
They were very helpful.
Yes. Yeah. Right. When did Cecil Pryor put on the Bring on the Telephones?
I don't know what year, but I got a picture of it in there.
Oh, really?
There's a picture.
And did you have a telephone too?
No,
Okay.
no.
Who got the different phones around the island?
Well, there's a picture of Cecil with the names of the people who had phoned and the numbers in the archive somewhere.
Oh, yes, right.
Yep.
Our number used to be 3 longs, 2 shorts.
Well, I guess there was one over at Ken Boss's house, and there's one at Dick Lee's.
Nice. What are some of the highlights for you as a family of living on the island?
We had foreign students from the University of New Hampshire stay with us every so often, and we'd drag two of those up there. And I remember one named Alex from India, and he really enjoyed it. It was all so different.
How about historical highlights? Down through the history of the island, there's so many interesting kind of episodes. Are there any ones that come to mind in particular that were important to you, the different things like whether it was Samoset or Robert Oram or some of the things that took place on the island historically?
Well, of course, there was Oram and Samoset, who were long gone. I think highlights for me were when I'd find one of these archival things. I picked up a lot of. First, when we were there, I patrolled the shore, and I found that somebody was still throwing cans in the ocean down by the shack. So we had to try to teach them not to do that. They'd throw them in back of their house instead. You have to do something with them. And I guess when I first discovered that there were these old things that were there that nobody else seemed to care whether they were there or not. That whole field in front of Bushnell's house, about halfway between the house and the shore, the midden really starts.
Oh.
And you'll see that the soil, the plants are different. And if you dig a little, and I always kept from digging there, I didn't dig for things. I picked up the stuff that was cleared by the tide. I kept my eye all along the tide there in front of Bushnell's particularly.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the other one in front of the shack, one year there were pieces of stove, iron stove, all kinds of pieces. You could almost build a stove with all the pieces on the shore.
Mm-hmm.
And they just disappeared. They're somewhere under that sand that they just disappeared, and we haven't seen them for years, but they'll show up again.
Those middens, were they oyster middens or clam middens, or what shells were under those middens?
There'll be clam shells.
They're clam shells,
Yeah.
okay, not oysters.
No, the oysters are in Damariscotta.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know why. I mean, I don't understand the sea shore enough to know why there would be clams one place and oysters in another, but no, Damariscotta has lots and lots of oyster shells, but they were all clam shells, and they're just packed.
Wow.
There's one piece of I don't know what, it's a piece of ceramic that was handmade, and a tiny piece that I didn't have the good luck to pick up, but Vance did. You remember Vance as Elizabeth Jackson's brother.
Oh, okay. Right.
And he is an astroarchaeologist.
Yeah. In terms of, were there any unusual people that you remember from the island? Going back, some of the original people.
They were all unusual. We all were. Everybody was unusual.
That's for sure.
We all are. Well, the kindness from the Pryors and the Giffords too.
Yeah, yeah.
They were very kind. And of course there was Coretta and her crowd, and of course they were the ones that came and stole our dinghies and stuff like that.
Oh, dear, yeah,
That other crowd, they were related to Coretta
yeah. Oh,
by marriage, I think,
that's right.
and they were a problem.
Were there any historic conflicts on the island that people shared with you? Between the north end or the south end, any kind of conflicts among the year-rounders or even the summer people?
No, not until Plimpton came, I guess. 'Cause I stirred up a hornet's nest with him, but actually, when I was going through after a while and I was collecting and gradually accumulated stuff, and I got to thinking about the women who were there, and there was Helen Pole, and she was a highly educated lady, and Letty, Cecil's mother, and I wondered, you know, did these gals get along? How did this work? I mean, this is a small place, and you just don't know. Well, somewhere in that stuff that I got from Michael Cheney's house, there was a little card about that big, and it's in that collection, and it's one of them is saying to the other one, "You'll be gone for a week and I'll miss you." That, or something of that nature. And I thought, okay, now I know. Everything was okay. I just felt better about it.
Yes, exactly.
Because it's a small place and you could have terrible feuds. But I didn't have the feeling that there were feuds, except when the people knew that somebody really was stealing or something like that. And we knew that, like with Frank Elwell, oh, Lord love us.
A long time ago, you shared a wonderful story, and I asked that you might share it again, about when you were clamming in the creek, suddenly you saw the tide rise and fall, the tide rise and fall, all within a period of about an hour. Could you relate that story about this amazing tide?
It's written in. Also, when I was clamming, my husband was on the island. He wasn't always there, but he was on island. He was cleaning out the bait shack. We had bought that piece of land from somebody. There were 28 or 30 people on the list. And I just lately dug that out because I'm going to need it transferring this property. And Bill came up for lunch and he said, "I found a coal hod in the bait shack," because we just bought it and he was cleaning out. There was a lot of old rope and junk in there, and there probably still is. But he said, "Nice coal hod." When he went back down, the coal hod was gone. Frank Elwell was using it to put his clams in that he was digging.
Oh dear. I see. Yeah. Interesting.
The Bushnells paid $5,000 for their property.
Oh.
And they had several acres, really, right on the shore.
Yeah.
And I didn't envy them. I just know that that's a fact.
Right. Now.
Elwell thought he still owned the property.
Oh.
And he came every year and broke into that house and would actually poop here or there
Oh.
to make sure they knew he'd been there.
Oh, dear me, dear me.
Yeah.
You had started about that tide, the multiple tides when you were clamming.
Well, it was the middle of the afternoon, and it was a whole bunch of people on island, and they were down in the creek. That's where the kids people would swim down in the creek when the tide was up. So we're down in the creek, and all of a sudden the water goes right out of the creek. All gone.
So it had gone from high tide to low tide.
Yeah, the water was clear up to waistcoats,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden it just goes, whoosh, and the creek's empty. So we're standing there kind of trying to size things up, and the water comes back. Right back up to the head of the creek. We wait around a few minutes, it goes out again. It kept doing this 7 times. Either 7 or 8, but I've written it, I wrote about it. And Jonathan Landsberg was out in his he had a little dinghy, and he's about 11, 12 years old, and he got washed right out into the ocean, so to speak. And Marie Monaco, whatever, her little dinghy just got taken right out into the stream. And Jonathan we were lucky Jonathan didn't happen to be at a place that it was going to matter if he got washed a little bit, because he could have been turned upside down with that little dinghy that he had. But I waited for the whole thing to be done. I was supposed to be making a birthday cake for somebody, but I thought, I don't think I'm going to have this experience again, and birthday cakes come every year. You have to decide what's important.
Now, we had shared a little earlier about Andrew Wyeth painting on the island and asking about the hearse. How did that story, what do you remember about that story and how Andrew Wyeth got the hearse from the island?
I don't really know how he got the hearse from the island. I know that guy, it's a famous painter and photographer. One of those very strange Finnish names, and he lived up that way. And he and Andrew Wyeth knew each other. And he took a picture of Andrew, which is up in the Sisport.
Oh.
Up in Sisport in that museum. And that was when they went over and got it and brought it off.
Huh.
But we do have that letter.
Yes, exactly. Lorraine, you're always an incredible inspiration to me, and I would ask, what is the source of your amazing moral compass? Where do you draw this kind of moral discipline and compass from?
Didn't know I had it. If I have it, it's just because it seems the right way to go.
Did you get it from your parents, from your religious background, from your social background?
Well, my parents were, they'd be considered really poor people now. We never went without food, but we lived on a farm in Maine for a while, and my father was making $1 an hour when he could get any work. So you can imagine that it wasn't, we didn't have any extras, you could put it that way. But we always had food and we always had clothing. My mother sewed, and we had cousins down in Massachusetts that would send us bundles of clothing that they were done with, and Mother would redo it, and we were happy. I still do that. I still think that's the way to live. I'm gonna make use of whatever it is I've got. You don't throw anything away until it's really, really time to.
As we've been chatting, is there any question that you were hoping I might ask of you that I didn't ask? Or is there any story that you thought you would like to share about the island that we haven't kind of come upon yet?
I think that this whole phase of my life that's been entangled with Louds Island history has been very nourishing. And I don't know if it fulfilled something that I needed, not having any great background of my own, but it's been a labor of love.
Wow. Well, all I would like to simply say is thank you so much. For the almost 50 years I've known you, you have been that inspiration to me. I have just loved being with you always, and thank you so much for this very lovely time together.
It's been nice. I hope you can make something. I don't know that you need to put all that stuff about me in there, but I'll have to let you be the judge.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for a lovely afternoon.
Well, thank you,
Thank you.
gentlemen.
Thank you.
Great.